Neville Hall, welcome to the 56th conversation in the frame of the IDEA program of Institute Abeceda. To start, I will kindly ask you to introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is Neville Hall, and I'm originally from New Zealand, born in 1962, and I studied at Auckland University, and then I came and did some courses in Europe, and in 1993 I moved to Slovenia, and I've lived here since then.
And how would you present your compositional practice and your compositional work to our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to emphasize to start with is that I really place emphasis on aesthetic experience. So I suppose in a way that's a very traditional view of the artist as someone whose job or whose function in society is to provide high quality aesthetic experience. So the question for me is really, what is the aesthetic dimension of art, and how can the artist provide high quality experience in that way?
And while you are composing, how are you thinking about this experience? Do you put yourself in the place of the listener? Do you imagine listening to this work? Do you imagine performing it? Do you imagine it as a independent, let's say, entity of any particular person involved in it?
Well, yes, I mean, I think as a composer, you really have to try and become the ideal listener in a way. So of course that involves listening to a lot of music and thinking about it and studying it, so that you're always placing yourself in the position of the listener, because you're constantly making decisions as you're composing. So you're hearing what you're writing, assessing it, revising it, making choices between different options, based purely on your experience as a musician, you know. But I think with regard to the kind of mission of emphasizing aesthetic experience, or the aesthetic dimension of art, the real question is about technique more than anything, because it seems to me that the idea of a piece of music is essentially the technique of the composer. Or you could put it the other way, you could say that the technique is the idea. So that's what you really have to work on consciously as a composer. Whereas the actual act of composing, there's a lot of intuitive work, as I've just explained, based on your experience and skill as a musician, where you're just making decisions that you couldn't really explain. You couldn't say why you chose this rather than this, except by saying it seems better or it sounds better, you know. And in thinking about aesthetic experience and the aesthetic dimension, I think, I mean, we associate the word aesthetic with the word beauty often, you know, but I think it's better to go back to the etymological kind of derivation of aesthetic and think of it more in terms of perception. So my personal aesthetic experience is like a kind of, when you're perceiving something aesthetically, you're really focusing on the material substance of whatever it is you're perceiving. So it reminds me a lot of Edmund Husserl's concept of epoche, or a kind of bracketing, where you take a particular experience and you kind of strip it of its everyday connotations, its everyday meaning, and see it afresh. And Husserl associates that with a sense of astonishment or wonder, you know. And that's how I often feel when I'm perceiving a work of art that has really strong aesthetic dimensions, is that kind of sense of wonder and amazement at just the way it is as a material object, you know. Mm. So that's kind of my starting point.
Right, and there's a couple of parts of your response that I do want to ask sub-questions about.
Yeah.
And the first one is, you use the phrase an ideal listener.
Yeah.
Often ask composers about, what, for example, what a listener can do to prepare and even to, co-create what is in the end the composition, right? Or the performance
Mm.
composition, the reception
Hmm.
composition. And it's not that often that I receive a very clear answer to this question. I get a feeling that there is there are a lot of restraints that composers have in relation to putting, any kind of responsibility really to the listener, which I do understand as whoever is receiving the work should. I understand the impulse not to rely on the person on the receiving end, but I also do think that this is something that is worth discussing, since I strongly believe there are a lot of listeners who are willing to do their part and who are willing
Absolutely.
to put, their attention, their energy, their work, in a sense, in being able to receive better and, as stated, co-create really the totality of the performance, right?
Absolutely. My point of view is that the listener has full responsibility for recreating the work, and to listen within our, here I'm speaking, of course, within a Western tradition of music making, the one that we're familiar with. I say that only because I'm not really familiar with enough with other traditions to claim that they have the same bases as we do. So let's just put that as a statement, a precondition, that for now we're talking about Western music and the tradition that we're used to working in. Here, I think, as I just said, the listener really has full responsibility for understanding the work, but it's not. There's a combination of I suppose what you could call passive synthesis and active synthesis in the process. I mean, it's not like you have to study everything, study the scores and study books about music before you can understand it, because we actually get really strong skills. From birth, virtually, we start assimilating skills that enable us to understand and to be receptive to the effect of music, which is the crucial thing, I think. It's like, but I do think that there is this active component as well. And maybe one way of thinking about it is to think about the work itself, So obviously we can talk about musical works as being made up of events. Now, without going into a lot of detail about discussing what is an event, where does it stop, where does it start and stuff, let's just say that we can agree that musical works are made up of events, if only by virtue of the fact that music exists in time, So the way I think about it is each event has kind of two dimensions to it. One is looking inwards towards the piece, and one is looking outwards towards the musical tradition. So an event in a piece, if it's a good piece, a well-composed piece of music, every event will have some kind of structural bearing on the overall piece. So that's the inward kind of look, But then every event also has an effect that's effect with an A. So it's like a kind of, it creates some kind of psychophysical change in the listener. And that's something that I think can only really be intuitive through and is acquired through years of experience of listening. So if you take these kind of dual elements, I think that the ideal listener is someone who manages to keep those two things in balance. So as you're listening to the work, you're listening very actively to make sure you're kind of reconstructing and understanding how the piece works, but you're also very open to the effects side of it, just the kind of psychological side of what you're getting from the piece.
And here, as you said, this ties actually to the field of aesthetics that you mentioned already, and
Mm-hmm.
in the original etymological meaning, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
For example, my background is I'm starting to, let's say, gain a background in philosophy, and in a course on aesthetics that I was a part of this year, a very strong relation was created between aesthetics and empathy, right? Both starting in the original meaning, so aesthesis
Of
and
empathy.
as
Yeah.
empatheia is again in the original etymological meaning of entering the pathos of.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what I think about when you
Yeah,
discuss.
I think Deleuze summed up artistic practice really well in his book, What is Philosophy? Where I don't know if you're familiar with that book, but he discusses philosophy, science, and art, kind of contrasting them as cultural practices. And he identifies art as blocks of affect and percept. And here I think that ties in exactly to what I'm saying, is like, on the one hand, there's affect, there's the kind of this psychophysical response that we have to works of art. And then on the other side, percept, I mean, with Deleuze, he doesn't always explain exactly what he's trying to say. But I understand percept as being the kind of cognitive residue of perceiving a work of art. So in a piece of music, you're left with a kind of, in a way, a map of the piece of music. You understand it as a whole. I mean, that's if you're listening actively and listening, what I would say, in a quality way. You're not just kind of, it's not just a series of responses to particular musical impulses. You're trying to put the whole thing together and understand it, how it works as a whole, And of course, in our composed tradition in Western music, where we have a score and then we have individual interpretations of that score. So we get to hear a piece, essentially the same piece over and over and over again. That you start to establish a relationship with that piece and really understand how it works as a whole. So the more you listen to it, the more each individual event makes sense in a way. And that interacts with affect as well, I think. So yeah, that's another aspect of being the ideal listener, is really just to know the repertoire and to engage with pieces in a very deep way, which may also involve studying scores, reading about composers' techniques, not reading about composers' lives. I don't think that has any relevance really to the experience of music, of an individual piece at least. So yeah.
But this sense of a whole, and
Yeah.
in my experience, is something that can be difficult to hold in your mind while composing. I don't know if that is
While composing.
sometimes yes.
No, I don't find that. I mean, okay, individual composers have a different approach, but that has to be the initial impulse. And in my opinion, that's the impulse for composing. That's how composing works. It's putting things together into a whole. So that underlies the whole thing. In my mind, there's no kind of, it's not difficult to keep it in mind unless you compose as an improviser. I mean, you can hear improvisational compositions where composers are just kind of making it up as they go along because they don't hold together, and that's the difference between, you hear really quality composers and everything fits together. It's like Ligeti said about his music, is like, he said, if you change one thing in a piece, it would logically send a ripple of change right through the whole piece because everything is so organically bound together. So if that's your approach, if that's your starting point, then in a way, I think it's not something that you have to keep in mind as you're composing. It's like, it's what composing is in a way. Composing is putting it together and making it whole.
Right.
It seems to me anyway.
So you never this sense of a whole, even when you are very deep in composing one element or
No,
one
because
bar of music, if you will. This is
no,
not a skill that you had to learn. This for you is the disposition.
no, this is what I was talking about before about technique, and technique being something that the composer has to invent. You can't just find it. You can't. It doesn't just arrive. We're not in an era of common practice. I mean, it must be wonderful. It must have been wonderful for Beethoven. He could just inherit a practice and then perfect it and advance it. But it's not like that for us now. I mean, you can't take someone else's technique and start using. Well, you can, of course, but then it seems to me you're not really composing, because today composing is actually finding a way of creating music, and that way is the technique. So that's really the absolute center of the project. That's what the whole thing is. So the way I compose it is like there's a process that I know that is mapped out from beginning to end. There's a process, but it's not a process that has any specific outcome. The outcome emerges from the process of composing, just as at the same time as the material emerges through the process of composing. But because there is a process, there is something happening, that there's never a moment where it's just floating, it's just random. There's still a lot of room for spontaneity. You still to get the actual specific solution takes a lot of imagination and a lot of work and a lot of thought. But if you're working within a process, then it's guaranteed that the whole thing is going to fit together in the end.
Right.
Can you understand what I mean by that? I know that for me it's clear, but for someone who's outside, it may not be clear what I'm saying. So.
No, it is clear. It is also, I can see, I think, what you are speaking to after listening to your compositions as well.
Yeah.
Perhaps before we go on with the conversation, it would be good for you to tell me how exactly you see technique.
Mm-hmm.
What do you understand under the term?
That's a good question. Yeah.
Method, approach,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and what is your compositional process? Because I think that these are terms that almost every composer I work with uses, but there are very, very different degrees of definition actually of
Yeah.
terms.
Okay, well, I would take the broadest definition of technique as being just, excuse me, there's a tractor passing my window. Okay, I live in the country, so this is a slight disadvantage. Okay, so yeah, technique, I take the broadest definition as just being a series of actions that the composer executes in the process of composing. Okay, so here I want to keep it as broad as possible, because as I said before, I think that this is really essentially the composer's idea. The composer's idea is this series of actions. Okay, and let me explain that let me illustrate that by saying how I compose, which is what you've really asked me to do. Okay, is first my composition is based on sound objects, right? So what's a sound object? You could imagine it as, say, I mean, a lot of people watching this maybe have had experience of working with sound synthesis, or at least have a synthesizer. So if you have a synthesizer, you can create a patch so that when you press a key, a certain evolution of sound emerges, And so a sound object to me is like that. It's like something that is bound together as a whole. It's like a cell, and it has a certain metamorphosis. Okay, so for example, a simple sound object might be a loud chord on the piano, and the sustain is picked up by string harmonics, which gradually ascend in a glissando and then reach a point where they merge with some wind trills. I'm just giving a very simple illustration to try and say what I'm talking about when I say sound object. Okay, so I start with a particular sound object, which it's a sketch that has all of the dimensions of sound very precisely sketched out, noted down, except pitch. So I eliminate pitch from the process to start with, okay? Now you might say, okay, how can you imagine a sound without pitch? But I think it's actually quite easy to do, especially if you've worked with electroacoustic music, which I did a lot when I was studying, is that going back to that analogy I was explaining with the synthesizer, you know, it's like you create this patch, which has a certain shape to it, and you can press any key on the synthesizer to trigger that patch, and it'll come out at a different pitch. But you can still clearly identify it as being the specific sound object that you've created. You know, so I put pitch aside, you know. So imagine I had this sound object, then I create a variant of that sound object, okay? And then for the next phase of growth, let's call it growth, for the next phase, I combine variants of the first two objects into a new one. So what we've got now, we've got the original cell, one variant of that cell, and then the combination of two variants. Then the next phase of growth is the combination of the previous two in the varied form. So here, this is the process of the Fibonacci series. So if you explain it numerically, you start with one cell, then you have one again, which is the variant. And then after that, you have two, 1 plus 1. Then you have 3, 2 plus 1. Then you have 5, 3 plus 2, and so on. And so you get this organic growth. Still, all of the material is conceived without pitch. So I end up with these very elaborate sketches of exactly what all of the instruments are going to do, but without defining the notes. And then in the end, the final phase is to actually work through and systematically assign pitches to all of the sounds that I've created. So you go through the whole piece like this. And of course, I have a system for working out pitch, which is, I could loosely describe as a kind of post-spectral thing, which I won't explain because it's really boring explaining systems like that, you know. But I hope you can understand what I mean. It's a little bit abstract, quite difficult to explain it without charts and without showing you exactly what's what, you know. Actually, I have here, I'm just working on an orchestral piece at the moment. I'll just hold up part of a sketch and maybe your viewers will be able to see it. I'll see if I can do this. I don't know if it's going to work or not. Probably you're just seeing a blank piece of paper, right?
I do see, I see the structure.
Can you see the kind of hieroglyphics on there?
Yeah. I can see, you know, how they're placed. And I can pick out the...
So it's not ideal. And so doing this, I mean, there are like, I would say there are two kind of two slogans that I could use to really summarize my technique. One is the idea of form as a product of growth, okay? And that should be clear from what I've just explained. And the other one is the structural use of timbre. So really approaching composing much like you do with electroacoustic music, where you're really focused on pure sound rather than notes, rather than organizing notes, you know. So these two things really create the framework for my creative process. And one of the things I like about this technique is that it means that everything is bound together, because ultimately everything is derived from that first cell. It's just elaborated in you know, a million possible different ways. So you get that, you know, there's a process, but there's an enormous freedom in it, because once you have the initial cell, you can do anything with it. It's purely up to your imagination. And I really think that element of imagination is absolutely crucial. That's like the motor that's driving everything, you know. And if you're a experienced listener, that's where you're creating these links with the body of music that's out there in the world, because you're making decisions all the time and coming up with stuff that for you as a listener has a kind of musical impetus to it. So it has an effect, it makes sense musically, and it has a kind of emotional weight to it, you know. So it's not it's not like, I mean, if you think about the generation that I belong to, so I was born in the 60s. Of course, we were brought up with serialism as being the big idea, you know, and that was when I went to music school, I had an excellent composition teacher who never forced a technique on anyone. But in the second year of study, at the beginning of the year, he came and he said, okay, at some point you're going to have to learn the 12-tone technique, and we're going to do it now. And so we learned the classic kind of 12-tone, which is not serialism, but we learned classic 12-tone technique. But see, that's the kind of environment that I was brought up in. And once you get to serialism, when you get very highly determined pieces, so it's like starting a process and just working it. It's like, you know, cranking the machine and the music comes out the other end. So it took quite a while in my own development to get that out of my system and to see the problems with that, because it's very appealing in a way that, you know, it's like a kind of, you know, that a kind of view of the world as being determined and positivist, and it's a very safe, cozy kind of place to be. But in the end, it's not satisfying creatively. I have to say that Boulez, for example, immediately recognized that. He said that after he did those integral serial pieces where everything is determined by the system, he immediately recognized that it's a prison, you know, creatively. It's just a cage, and you have to move away from it.
So as I understand, you do have a system. The, let's say, steps of the process are known in advance, but
Yes.
the performance actually of this system is,
that's a good way to put it, yeah.
through imagination to an extent.
That's right. So there's a process. It's a very clear process, but it's not a process that determines anything specific. All it does is it says that, okay, once you've got this, you're going to do something with it. And that something can be anything. So who knows? And that's why when I start writing a piece, I really don't know how it's going to turn out. It's not like, I mean, the formal design is not like a preconceived container that you pour material into and like a mold, you know, it's not like that at all. It's kind of, it's very organic, and it kind of, in a way, it's very romantic, you know. It's a kind of a tribute to nature, the natural world. That sounds really corny, I think. But anyway, there you go. And that, in a way, also ties back into what I was saying about Husserl and epoche, where you have that kind of sense of wonder about when you perceive things clearly, you know, when you perceive the material clearly, you just have that sense of wonder. And that's something I think we all experience. I mean, if, you know, who do you know, especially in Slovenia, where we have such a beautiful natural environment, everyone says, oh, I went for, you know, a walk in the mountains and blah, 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 you know. So, and who hasn't stopped in front of a tree and just looked and thought, my God, that's amazing, that's incredible, you know. And so that for me is what aesthetic experience is all about. And in a way, as an artist, I think you're trying, you know, the key thing is to provide that experience, or to add that experience to the community, to give something, you know, to the community, to provide that experience.
And just how we sort of intended it with the tree. But I do have a devil's advocate question.
Yeah, you go for it, yeah.
Which is my question when I'm confronted with, you know, a system, a compositional system that determines the process to any degree. Might be, you know, those very determined ones that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Or, you know, systems that are open as the one that you're describing, or actually as, you know, composing a sonata movement is a system. My question is, where does this first cell come from, right? In your case, where does the first object come from? Because all the rest of the steps are at least clear to some extent. If you give me the object and I spend time with your score, I will probably be able to see with at least some clarity where the second, the third, the fourth one came from. And if I know what you just told me, I will have a key to go by and so on. But that first one remains a mystery, right?
Exactly, yeah.
My question.
And that's just like if you look at Beethoven's sketchbooks, you know, he comes up with an idea and then he refines it and works on it. So where does that idea come from, that initial idea? That's the mystery, that's the starting point in a way, you know. So that has no logical source, that, you know, and that's the beauty of it. I think that's the that's the whole thing about creativity, isn't it? It's like,
Right, yeah.
you start with nothing and suddenly you've got something there. Where did it come from? I mean, it's incredible, really, you know. That's the beauty of the human mind. So yeah, I don't see that as being a particularly big deal. I mean, okay, so if you're writing serial music, you have to make choices. That you can make choices about the series that you start with, and you can take a Weberian approach where you have cells, you know, or a Berg approach where you have a series that actually has tonal connotations. So, you know, even when you're working with very determined music, at some initial point, you have to make some decisions. And it's really hard to say, okay, why did I make that decision and not another? Why did I put that note first and that note second? I don't know. Maybe it just sounded better, you know, or maybe it was just completely random. Maybe you could just throw a dice like John Cage. And although here, this is where I think that John Cage has a big problem, you know, but anyway, maybe we shouldn't go into that, because I think there's such an enormous qualitative difference between imagining something and randomly generating something using dice or tarot sticks or whatever. I think there's such an enormous qualitative difference. And I think the throwing dice solution really dehumanizes art. You know, it takes away the human element, and art is a human activity. It's only defined within the framework of human existence. There's no kind of mystical meta existence of art, you know.
But
yeah. Sorry?
I just wanted to say that also with the dice throwing and all the similar, you know, practices that we can see or read about, it's not really random, right? It's extremely specific. He's a specific person that's sitting, you know, in a chair that someone made, behind a table that someone made, and throwing these dice that someone designed. And there's this whole system that he set up for what the dice throwing will, you know, sell. And then there's his handwriting when he writes it down, and the, you know,
yeah, no,
throw with the particular muscle in his. I have always I have my reservation in seeing that as random in any sense. It's just I almost see it as a, you know, this attempt really to place the responsibility somewhere else, not to, you know, avoid responsibility, but yes, to reposition it. But it's not. I don't think it's random.
Okay, I'm not sure if I agree with that, but because I think that here you've described two systems that have this interface of the dice throw. Okay, so you've described a system, a physical system, in a way where someone's sitting in a chair and they have their environment, you know. And then after the dice throw, there's the question of what they do with the results, you know. Okay, now that's important. That's not a trivial question, you know. But the moment of the dice throw is like a dislocation. It's like, it is truly a random event unless you have a weighted dice or something. Okay, which is in a way is interesting, because to come up with things that are random is actually incredibly difficult. There's a whole science of randomness, you know, is that we think of randomness as just that we could easily come up with a series of random numbers. But in fact, if you or I wrote a series of random numbers, it would immediately fail at any test of randomness, because one of the tests is that you typically have a certain number of repeated numbers in the series, and it's something that most people who come up with random numbers don't repeat the numbers. And okay, so we're going down a different kind of track here. But I think that the problem with the dice throw as part of a compositional technique is that it misses the opportunity to connect with the tradition, with the body, with the cultural edifice that is music, you know. And that's with John Cage. I mean, he had a lot of strategies for kind of distancing himself or dislocating himself from that edifice, and he wanted to do that, you know. But what do you get when you do that? I mean, what's the advantage of doing that? The idea of like starting from scratch, starting with a tabula rasa, is pointless, because artistic practice, the whole kind of the reason we do it and we get so much from it as listeners, is that, you know, it satisfies our kind of aesthetic needs. And I think that all cultures, all people have some kind of essential need for aesthetic activity, you know, aesthetic experience. And to try and break that down, I mean, in my personal view, as soon as you do that, as soon as you take a project and do it the way John Cage did, you immediately devolve into cleverness. His whole project is clever. He's doing smart little clever things, and you know, and it's probably generated thousands of doctoral theses in academies and universities. But that's not what art is about, in my personal opinion. Heaps of people disagree with that. But I think that that element of randomness is problematic in a way. Okay, you could use it. You could use it as a way to kind of activate the subconscious. That's how David Bowie apparently did that when he was writing lyrics for his songs. He would put words on pieces of paper, just kind of throw them up in the air, see how they land, and start to put the poetry together based on just these random combinations of words. And you can see how randomness can be a way of stimulating the imagination. But I don't think that's really what Cage is about. He's more about eliminating imagination.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'm trying to say is that it's not really random, in my view.
No, I think that a dice throw satisfies every definition of randomness. It's almost the epitome of randomness.
Yes, but in this context, it's no longer.
I don't think so. I don't think the context changes it. A dice throw is a dice throw. It doesn't matter if I'm doing it or if a monkey is doing it.
Yeah.
It's still a random, you know, the purpose of it, the whole point of it is to get a random result. And unless the dice is weighted in some ways, that statistically it will always give you a random result.
But perhaps from what you now explained, this could be this could be a question for aesthetics with a lot of weight in your practice. So the origin of this first object position. On one end, of course, there's all the aesthetic questions of the experience that you already discussed, but in theory, this I think could be is a very important question that at the same time can probably never really be tackled, or if it is tackled, not responsibly, it could actually it could change or diminish the potential of all the future first objects, right? That's
I think are you just saying that the first object is very important?
Yeah, but that wondering about it changes it immediately, right?
They're wondering about it.
Yes, speaking about it or trying to theorize it or trying to predict what it will be.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean, what you're doing is you're trying to perfect it, you know. So it's just like what I said before about Beethoven sketchbooks, you know, it's like you have this initial idea, and then you have to look at it and think, how can I improve that? And you can always find some way to improve it. So you have to, you're right that it's a really crucial point in the compositional process. But in the end, you have control on that over that, and you refine it to a point where you say, okay, that'll do, and you start going on with the piece. I mean, you know what they say about works of art is that they're never finished. You just abandon them at some point. So that's how it is with that initial cell as well. You work on it, and then at some point, but you have an intuitive feeling with that. You say, oh yeah, that's good, you know. And you do this over a period of many days. So you kind of sleep on it and you come back to it and, you know, go through it in your head. I mean, most of composing for me is done while I'm walking or while I'm away from the paper, you know. While I'm going to sleep, it's a great time to compose. So it's all there. It's in your imagination. You're kind of moving things around in your head, but eventually you decide on something.
And when in the timeline of composing a new piece does this initial stage for you come? Is this when you already know the instrumentation, the occasion, or are
Yeah.
ideas independent of any, you know, logistical, if you will, factors? Or
No, you absolutely, you have to know the instrumentation because I'm working with sound and not notes, but that's your material. That's where you start with. You have to know what the instruments are, you know. And from there you can take it.
So it's never just you know, an object in a vacuum. It's always
No, not because I'm writing instrumental music. It always that's the absolute essence of the technique. Really, is focusing on the instruments and the combinations of instrumental sounds, the potential of the instruments. Just going back, something occurred to me with regard to you're saying that about finding this first object. You know when Bach wrote fugues, he chose his fugue subjects because he knew the potential of the subject for developing it into a fugue. You know, and with experience of composing, it becomes the same with this process that I have. Is like when I'm creating that initial cell, I have a feeling for what kind of material has the potential to grow into an entire piece, and what kind of material doesn't, you know, or lacks potential. Or you could put it like this: you might come up with an initial idea, and you start thinking about it and think, okay, but that doesn't really have the potential to become a piece. You know, I have to do something more with this. I have to add something, shape it a little bit more, until it gets to that point where it's actually fertile, and then it kind of explodes, you know.
I'm asking, I did expect this answer, but I am asking because it would, I think from what you're describing, be possible, you know, if this initial object was, let's say, if we just shaved off a few layers that are tied to instruments, it would be possible to do this in a vacuum. I was just wondering what this, but if you say that this is actually a crucial part of it, that's important information for me, because that leads me to ask if you would say the instruments or the sound itself, you know, the physical sound is one of the dispositions for your compositions.
I'm not quite sure what you mean by disposition. Can you explain it?
So a starting point, let's say.
A starting point, okay, yeah. Yes, and that's when I mentioned these two kind of basic ideas that I have about music, about form as a product of growth, and the other one being the structural use of timbre. It's this is the crucial thing, you know. In a way, it's shifting away from abstraction and taking the really unique, complete sonic quality of an act of performing on an instrument. Let me explain what I mean by that, okay? We can all recognize a violin, right? We hear a violin being played, yeah. But if you write a particular note on the violin, it makes it a difference which string that note is played on, you know. It makes an enormous difference where the bow is placed with regard to the bridge and the fingerboard. Then the dynamics make an enormous difference, you know. That note is going to sound completely different if it's played loudly or softly or whatever, you know. So once you start to put together all of these dimensions and start thinking about all the dimensions of instrumental sound, that each notated instrumental sound is really unique and has to be approached as a unique thing. So when I'm coming up with these cells or whatever, I'm thinking really exactly about the kind of register and the kind of sound, the dynamics, the way it's going to be bowed, where the bow is going to be. This is the sound. This is by doing this, you're kind of flipping the traditional approach to musical material, because traditionally you can take a Beethoven symphony and you can make a piano reduction and you can play it on the piano and everyone recognizes it and it's clear. You basically have it there, you know. So in that sense, the instrumentation of the symphony is not really essential to the symphony itself, you know. In a way, the symphony exists in a more abstract form, you know. And here I flip that, because with my music, you can actually change all the notes, but you're still going to get the same piece. And I did this recently, actually. I just recently had a performance of an orchestral diptych. So there's two orchestral pieces that fitted together. And the central cell for both of those pieces is exactly the same. So in a way, that's why I wanted to do it, because I wanted to say, okay, you take this cell, let's see what happens if you develop it here. Okay, and let's see what happens if you do a completely different development from that cell, you know. So, you know, both pieces, the central movement was purely the cell itself, nothing else, but with different notes. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting that after we'd been rehearsing for a while and we were talking about playing through the pieces, and the conductor said, oh, we did, in the second piece, he said, oh, we don't need to do this because we've done it. It's the same. He said, it's the same as in the first piece, you know. And the musicians, the lead violinist actually said, well, actually it has different notes, you know, we need to rehearse it. And he hadn't actually realized, it seems he hadn't actually realized that that these two pieces actually are completely different notes. Because when you hear them one after the other, I mean, they just sound so similar. They really do. And because they were in the middle of the pieces, he was hearing them with a big gap in between of other music. And he hadn't picked up on the fact that these were actually different notes in this one, you know. So I thought that kind of vindicated my approach in a way. That's actually one thing I should mention in understanding my piece, because you were saying before, would I be able to find the cell, you know, if I looked at the piece? In fact, what I do is each of these phases of growth. So here we're talking about the initial cell, and then each rounded phase as it gets bigger and bigger, I present as a separate movement in the piece. You may have noticed that in some of my pieces, you know. So somewhere in the piece, there'll be a very short movement of just a few seconds, and that will be the actual initial cell. And then I always label the movements with numbers so that you can see the sequence, but I don't usually present them in the original sequence. So I'll start with maybe the fifth phase of growth, and then maybe the third one, then the fourth, and the second, and so on, because it's more interesting formally to do it like that, yeah.
Does that mean that you do not think about it linearly? So you think...
That's actually a really important aspect of this way of composing, is that it's not composing linearly in terms of time. So you don't start at the beginning and compose through to the end. It's a very sculptural approach, because I've simplified, to explain it, I've simplified the process a little bit. But one thing maybe I should mention now is that once you start combining the cells, I mentioned how you're combining individual ones. It's not a matter of putting one in front, one before the next, one before the other, and having a sequence. It's more like it's like a collision of these two cells or sonic entities. And in colliding, they kind of interact and they break apart and they kind of fuse in some parts. And I don't know if you can imagine what I'm trying to say here, but it's the interaction of the cells is complex. It's not just a matter of layering them or putting them one before the other. They smash together to make something new when they come together in a different part of the piece. Okay, so what you do is you get, and this development, which you could trace out the development in terms of, okay, here he started here. Okay, I see, yeah, he changed that a little bit, and here he changed this. Here he turned this around. Here he did this. You could lay that out in a line and see the whole thing, but in fact, in the piece, it's completely scattered through the piece. So it's very ambiguous. Like, where does something come from? But what I think you can hear, what I hope you can hear, is you hear there are relationships all the time. There's things sound similar to other things that you've heard before, and of course, I think, like all music, it's really essential to listen a number of times, and that's, I think, true of all music. I mean, you can't take a late Beethoven string quartet, listen to it once and say, oh yeah, I get it. You have to listen a lot of times before you can really see what's going on. You need to make that kind of map. And then on the other hand, if you have music that is very linear and is kind of like what I would call improvisational composition, where you just start at one point and keep going to the end, it doesn't stand up to that repeated listening, in my opinion. It doesn't have the complexity of temporal relationships that make it engaging to listen to. It's like, once you've heard it once, okay, it's that music. It's like turning on a tap, and it runs for a while and then you turn it off, and that's it.
Yep. I see why the luz is an important reference to you here.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to ask, while composing, while we started at using the sound itself as a starting point, and in relation to the instrument that's producing it, what is the smaller, like, what is the quantum, if you will, that you have in mind, that you are actively working with? I know this is a difficult question, but when I am speaking to composers, I get a sense that this is very different from composer to composer. Someone, the smallest, let's say, unit or element, but yes, unit, I suppose, is best, that they actively operate with. It is, for example, a pitch with the whole, the totality of it. So but for some, it's much smaller. It's like it's the just the sound of the bow being put on the string in preparation to perform this pitch, or it's bigger. It's a whole chord is the smallest unit that is really actively that they are using as a unit. Man, when composing, I'm not sure if this is clear.
No, it's clear what you're saying. It's a good question. And I'd say that I've consciously rejected a kind of atomistic approach to composing, because that's what serialism is, really. Serialism is very atomistic. You even break it down so that each parameter is treated separately in a series. You break it down to the smallest unit. And composing is conceived of like combining the atoms to create a world, What I'm trying to do is to not have a predetermined unit. So in a way, the cell that I've described is the basic unit once it's finished and ready. In a way, that's the unit. So it's a very big thing. But of course, you could break that down easily, just like you can break down a theme from a Beethoven sonata into smaller units, like the beginning of the Appassionata, that descending theme, you can break it down into small units if you want to. So here, yeah, I'm thinking of it as a whole, very consciously doing it that way, so that I'm not confining myself to combining things to make something big. but the crucial thing is the degree of sensitivity that you can apply to the individual moments of that event. And that's one thing I also really learned from working with electroacoustic music, is like not being satisfied, like, if you work with MIDI, the MIDI protocol, you've got note on, note off.
Yeah.
And a lot of composers work in a kind of note on, note off mode. For example, Vito Jura, I notice if you see him explain his use of computers in algorithmic music, everything is note on, note off. And that's completely antithetical to the way I work, because my idea is like, once a sound is initiated and it's in progress, then it's going to have a morphology. Something is going to happen to that sound. It will change. That's why performers get really pissed off when they play my music, because it's microscopic. They're always having to do something. The sound is seldom just sustained. They're having to shift their bow position or make some kind of micro glissando, or there's always some modification to the sound to give it that richness. So the surface has that kind of richness of the natural world. You know how rich the natural world is. So that's something I'm trying to achieve. Yeah. So I really don't like that kind of atomistic way of working. It's not how I work at all.
Yeah, of course, and that's, I think, not what I was actually partially aiming to what you now describe, if I
Yeah.
correctly, to ask you if you do actively think about, when you write something that on the paper is essentially a long note, right?
Mm-hmm.
And could be thought of in this on-off manner, if
Yeah.
To what degree of detail you think about it. This is what I was trying to ask, not necessarily if you then work with, if you then think about this, whatever the quantum of it is, independently and try to do something with this particular, but just to what degree it's, if this whole note was a sentence, it can be one word, or it can be 30,000 words. So I was trying to ask and see basically how small the smallest is in your mind composing, not
Okay.
well, the smallest operating
Yeah, I get it. Yeah,
a perceived unit.
but it's important, this kind of atomistic way of thinking about music. It is important to put it on the table, because that really was, in the 50s and 60s, a dominant way of thinking of music, that kind of pointillism. That was one thing I remember seeing an interview with Helmut Lachenmann, and he said that when he went to study with Nono, he became really depressed because Nono was insisting on a kind of pointillistic approach to music, which is essentially an atomistic approach, which is antithetical to Lachenmann's conception of music, which is much closer to the way that I work, where it's a morphology of sound, Yeah.
Well, because we are slowly approaching the end of this conversation, I do want to ask you about the future. So what are your, not necessarily plans that are already in motion? What are your dreams? What are your ideas? What do you want to compose at any point?
Yeah, well, my dream is to wake up tomorrow morning and have enough time to write some music. That's about it, really. I don't think in these terms of like some big ambition. The last 10 years, I've written mainly orchestral music, because after working and developing my technique over a lot of years, I've come to realize that orchestral music really is the perfect format for the way I think about music. And so I plan at the moment, the way I see it at the moment is that I just write mainly orchestral pieces. It's not to exclude anything else. Writing solo pieces and chamber pieces has been really exciting and really important for developing my knowledge and stuff. But writing for the orchestra, for me, is just the ultimate experience. It's just like you're in this universe of infinite possibilities, and it's just so exciting. I mean, it's incredible work, but it's just so engaging. But who knows? Maybe I'll wake up one morning and decide to write an opera. I mean, I can't see it, but could happen. Yeah.
Great. Looking forward to hearing the works that are still to come.
Thank you.
Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for taking the time, and have a good
You're welcome. Yeah, you too. Okay. Bye, Brino.